to this week's edition of World Crisis Radio. We're reporting here from Washington, D.C. It's 1 o'clock in the afternoon on Friday, the 28th of February, after a fascist coup in Kiev, Ukraine, which has perceptibly increased the danger to the entire world. Remember our premise. Ukraine is one of the most dangerous places in the world, much more dangerous than any place in the Middle East, for example, much more dangerous than Iraq, because it is here, primarily at the present time, that nuclear-armed forces may clash. If Ukraine, as now seems at least possible, should begin to split into parts, or if fighting should break out in various parts of Ukraine, we might have Polish NATO troops entering from the west and Russian troops entering from the east. The Russians can call on their own nuclear weapons, and the Poles can then turn to the United States. And because of this ill-considered, absolutely foolhardy idea of having Poland and these other former Warsaw Pact countries join NATO, they can call on the United States to intervene with nuclear weapons, first on the battlefield in Ukraine, and then, quite possibly, against Russia. So the premise has to be, butt out. The United States has no interest in Ukraine. We don't care about conditions inside Ukraine. Conditions in Ukraine are a purely Ukrainian matter. They do not regard the United States. There is no security threat. This place has been part of the Soviet Union. It's been part of Russia. We'll give you a little sketch of the history. The point is, there's nothing in Ukraine that's worth a single dead GI. That is the strategic reality. And don't listen to the neocon fascist madmen like McCain or others like this skank Victoria Nuland, who are trying to gin up the concern of the United States, allegedly, about what goes on in Ukraine. That is up to them, not the United States. No interest is involved. So what we're going to do today with the program is quite a bit of it will have the character, in effect, of a teach-in, because these are areas that are not much, have not much been in the public eye here in the U.S., and at least in some countries in Europe, in the last couple of decades. So what we need to come out of this with is a confidence on the part of all of you, the audience, to go forward and to argue that there must be no U.S., no NATO intervention in Ukraine. This is a question of the peace of the world. And if you want to know what it might end up with, go and see that movie from the mid-'80s, right? What's it called? The Day After, with Jason Robards, where a series of incidents between the United States and the Soviet Union leaves the little man, Jason Robards, sitting in the ruins of his home and weeping after a nuclear, or indeed thermonuclear, war. This must be avoided. And in particular, it's because the Russian argument is largely justified. The people who have taken power in Kiev now are a group of agents of the International Monetary Fund, and they are backed up by honest-to-God fascists, by a Sturmabteilung, brown shirts, SA. That is the so-called right sector, with various fascists included, right, under the leadership of this guy, Yarosh. The Svoboda Party of Tchernibok also qualifies as fascist. And they are the principal shock troops of this gaggle of IMF agents who are barely tolerated by the fascist street fighting types, but people like Yatsenyuk, Yats, the lapdog and errand boy of the skank Nuland, and some others, right? This character Turchinov, who was a stooge of Timoshenko, the gas princess, right? The blonde, the dyed blonde, as we now see. So this entire gaggle of people, we're going to expose them. We're going to have to discuss the weakness of Yanukovych, why he failed. And I think today, in his press conference in Rostov-on-Don, down in southern Russia, he has essentially apologized for his incompetence. I think he should have gone into that in much more detail. He left the Ukrainian police unarmed, no guns, facing a hail of Molotov cocktails, rocks, precision slingshots, which can kill, and other weapons. He essentially would not support his own police. And the Berkut were the riot police. They should have been given every possible support. The question is civilization. Will civilization survive, or will it collapse into Libya? The ultimate goal, right, the ultimate result of these destabilizations is obviously that the CIA and the MI6 and the DGSE and the BND, let's throw them in too, because they qualify, and the various Scandinavian, they have been in an attack on the modern state. Libya is a good example. Libya shows where it all leads. Syria shows where it all leads in another form. And now we've got the premises of a civil war and perhaps secessionism and partition in the second largest country in Europe geographically, and certainly along with France, Italy, Germany, one of the most populous of the continental European states. So this is a extremely dangerous mix, and with a little competence on the part of Yanukovych, it didn't have to go this far, but it's now here, and therefore it's essential to have comprehension and indeed support for the measures taken by Russia to contain this chaos, because these people are nuts, and they will not stop, and therefore, unfortunately, the language of force and the threat of force comes on the scene, not because of any aggressive campaign of the Kremlin, but rather because of the fact that you've got these fascists. Now, here is the situation as of right now. We've had the press conference of Yanukovych in Rostov-on-Don, as I mentioned, and he points out that power in Kiev has been seized by fascist thugs egged on by the Western powers, a fascist minority. We can go into this in some detail. And it is mob rule, as he says, because these cabinet ministers have been approved by a gang of thugs, the so-called Maidan or Euro-Maidan. Right? This is essentially the ostracism court of the Greek world. In other words, it's the cult of Dionysios, with this time with weapons. So he is, I guess, understanding too late that the chicken Kiev policy, right, the cowardice and appeasement of fascism, was a bad idea. Yes, and he keeps repeating that he tried to avert bloodshed. Maybe he needed to think a little bit more about saving the country rather than averting bloodshed. Maybe he cared too much about the Ukrainians and not enough about Ukraine, because Ukraine is now on the road to Libya unless something changes. We'll be back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Situation in Ukraine here on the afternoon of the 28th of February is that pro-Russian forces, these are most likely Ukrainian citizens who have been organized into militias or volunteer military formations. This is the Samoborona, self-defense. They have now taken control of the approaches to the Simferopol airport and the Sevastopol airport, and they also surround a Coast Guard base of the Ukrainians on the Crimean Peninsula. Remember, of course, that Crimea, historically a part of Russia, transferred as a purely administrative matter within the USSR from the RSFSR, the Russian Federated Socialist Republic, to Ukrainian SSR by Nikita Khrushchev in 1955, I believe. Remember that Khrushchev and indeed Brezhnev had done their military service in World War II in these Black Sea areas, the so-called Malaya Zemlya. So this was a way to transfer the administration, probably also with the political idea of gratifying the Ukrainians. Remember, Stalin, of course, was a Georgian, and these other groups, right? So there was the Soviet Union catered in turn to the various groups. Putin has announced maneuvers that were not widely reported in the West, at least 150,000 troops. The fleet in Odessa, the largest city in the Crimea, is where the fleet is, and various Western agencies report that there are Russian troop transporters, Russian trucks on the road in Crimea. Now, this is the principal thing to understand here is that there was already, even before this started, a large Russian military and naval presence in the Crimean Peninsula because of these bases. It is historically the base of the Russian Black Sea Fleet. Remember the famous movie, Battleship Potemkin? Remember when the Tsarist forces shoot all the people on the stairs? That's Odessa. And the Battleship Potemkin comes out. So that's the Black Sea Fleet. It's been there for a very long time. And, of course, under the Status of Forces Agreement, which is renting those bases until, I think, 2040 or 2045, Russia has the right to have some ground forces there. So Russian government has now said that they've increased those ground forces, makes sense, because of the hostile and threatening farnetications of this gang of fascists in Kiev. Now, I've switched into my rather more blunt language, but you get the idea. So the Samoborona, the people's militias or people's self-defense, have essentially begun to take custody of these areas simply because they don't want to have fascist forces flown in. Right? Suppose this guy Muzicho, the so-called Saakashvili of the right sector, a raving fascist, a raving SA, right? This guy could be Ernst Röhm. This is the guy you've seen on YouTube slapping and punching a police commissioner. This is the guy who went to Chechnya and fought with the Basayev, Doku Umarov, and these other killers. He fought with the Chechen rebels against the Russian army. And, of course, those are Chechen rebels paid for by Saudi Arabia. But, of course, Basayev, a notorious CIA agent. So that we can assume now that this Muzicho, Saakashvili, this character, is himself not entirely without connections to Langley and the CIA. So imagine if that guy wants to come into town with a battalion of his killers. Well, the answer to that has to be no. And we have the mayors and other local officials in the the Crimean Peninsula who say no, we don't want them. And this is, of course, understandable. And the hypocrisy, we can't catalog the hypocrisy at every step, but the hypocrisy of the Western media, right? If you get a gun and go into the streets of Kiev anytime in the last couple of weeks, you are a hero of democracy. But if you're an ethnic Russian, and this is the majority, it's about 60% in the Crimea, you get a gun and decide you're going to go to the airport and make sure that a bunch of fascists don't come flying in, then you're an armed gunman. You're a real bad guy. So we won't belabor this at every turn, but the hysteria, the hypocrisy of the West has never been greater. So this is the the situation. And indeed, we're getting reports of things going on in Balaclava, the site of the famous Light Brigade, the charge of the Light Brigade back in the Crimean War, right? And now for Lord Tennyson. So this is an area that has been fought over, this Crimea, and the Nazis were there. They took a significant part of it, and then the previous century with the British, the French, and the Ottoman Empire. So now the denunciation of Russia, we're told by the new interior minister, fresh from having been nominated by acclamation by this gang of dirty fascists in the Euromaidan or Majdanek, as I prefer to call it, right? The concentration camp. This new Majdanek, the interior minister says that this is an armed invasion and occupation by the Russians of parts of the Crimea. Who says this? Oh, it's Interior Minister Akavov. And who is Akavov? He's an international criminal. He's a jailbird. He was jailed in Italy on an Interpol warrant on the charge of stealing real estate back in Ukraine. So a criminal element comes to the fore, and now, of course, he is, what is he? Is he right sector or is he Svoboda? I think he is Svoboda at this point, the Freedom Party of this awful Tjanibok. So now you get an idea, right? Watch out who you're taking your news stories from. Anyway, the important thing to understand is that when it comes to the Crimea, the population is largely Russian, and the Russian forces are already there, and they've been there from time immemorial for our purposes, and having to fight off various kinds of imperialism. All right, so this is now the situation. Now we're going to describe in the next segment sort of how we got here, and how the weakness of Yanukovych is to be explained. Back in a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio, keeping up with the situation in Ukraine, the destabilization which is now peaked in a fascist putsch last Saturday into Sunday, and now the reign of terror is going on. Lots of people are being killed behind the scenes by these fascist thugs, the Sturmabteilung, the SA, the brown shirts. Normally, the National Endowment for Democracy and people like Gene Sharp like to come up with some trendy marketing slogan to give a name to this, right? The Roses Revolution of Georgia, Tiflis. They had the Cedars Revolution in Lebanon. That didn't work so well. What are you going to call this one? How about the Brown Revolution? Because it's the brown shirts, the fascisti, or the black shirts. You could have the Black Revolution, too. How about the Skinhead Revolution? Looks like quite a few of these people, including the current president, qualify as skinheads, or the Hooligan Revolution, something along these lines. Anyway, if you value civilization, you must oppose this gang with which fascism has returned to the world stage. I hope to do justice to this question later in the broadcast. But the fact that you now have a fascist regime in Kiev validates and confirms my concerns. I have been telling you for some years, fascism, Nazism do not belong solely to the period of the 1920s and 1930s up to 1945. Fascism did not stop in 1945. It is around us. It is the most timely of questions, right? And once you begin to see the world in terms of the fascists who may be in it, you're going to see it a lot more clearly, and maybe also you'll be spurred on to more activity. Let's look at Yanukovych, right? His weakness. We'll document the weakness in a second, but why? As like many of these post-Soviet places, Ukraine is a country where the local oligarchy, and in these in the Russian-speaking world, it's the nomenklatura. The nomenklatura essentially means the list of people who are qualified as, as oligarchs. And what they did in 1991 was simply that the oligarchs who were running these 16 union republics of the USSR, those oligarchs decided to play the nationalism card, the ethnic card, against Moscow and separate. But this was the way of those oligarchs to perpetuate and indeed to intensify oligarchical control. So they're more oligarchical after 1991, and that's when you get the super rich oligarchs in Russia running Yeltsin, people like Khodorkovsky, who now spent his decade in jail, and it's too bad that he's out. And similarly in Ukraine. Now, power in Ukraine tends to gravitate to the hands of these oligarchs. They are who they are because of nomenklatura privatization. The immense and valuable state property of Russia, Ukraine, and other component republics was essentially appropriated, stolen, grabbed by members of the oligarchy who are members of the nomenklatura, and that is where these fortunes come from. So they're all illegitimate, and they know it. Now, specifically, it's often said that the fascist activists, the 20, some people say 10,000, 20,000, at most 30,000, hardcore street-fighting types who kept this Maidan, Euromaidan going since last November. It's about 3 months now, I guess. December, January, February, more or less, started in late November. Those 10,000 to 20,000, or perhaps a little bit more, were paid. They were on stipends. They couldn't stay there on their own. They were getting, according to some estimates, the basic stipend was $25 a day, and maybe if you had special skills as a hooligan, you might get more. Where did that come from? Well, according to the Financial Times and the London Independent, this guy is named Petro Poroshenko, Poroshenko. He's the owner of the anti-government, anti-Yanukovych Channel 5 television in Kiev. He was considered the top oligarch supporting the anti-government protests. And he's a chocolate manufacturer. He makes confectionaries. He sells you sweets, as the British would say. A candy manufacturer. He's described by the London Independent as a cross between Willy Wonka and Che Guevara. Now, it's funny to some extent, but remember, there is a world chocolate and cocoa cartel. There is, like the grain cartel, like the coffee cartel. Many of these basic products, food products, are organized into cartels. And the British Cadbury Fry have historically had a lot to say about the running of this international coffee and cocoa cartel. So perhaps it's not quite a coincidence that Poroshenko undoubtedly hooked into the cocoa and chocolate cartel, turns out to be the main money bags of the fascisti in the Euromaidan. All right, so he was against Yanukovych from the beginning. Now, the other oligarch we should mention, the most rich, the most wealthy of all the Ukrainian magnates, was supposedly a supporter of Yanukovych. But with friends like this, you don't need enemies. It is Rinat Akhmetov, Akhmetov. So Rinat Akhmetov, supposedly big friend of Yanukovych, was one of the people constantly whispering in his ear, you got to avoid bloodshed, don't crack down, don't start shooting, don't send the tanks, don't send the helicopters, it'll all work out somehow. And at the key moment in the week or so before the ouster, the coup against Yanukovych, Rinat put out a statement saying, Rinat Akhmetov urges an end to the bloodshed in the streets of Kiev and calls on all the opposing parties to return to the negotiation process immediately and continue to work without any delay until a solution is found that would take Ukraine out of this deep political crisis. Yeah, fine. Certainly, Yanukovych was gullible enough to go for that. But, of course, people like Chanibok and Yarosh and this other character that we've just mentioned, the Chechen war veteran terrorist, no, they're not going to go for that. Now, then we have the sort of middle camp, right? The middle camp, Viktor Pinchuk. This is interesting. He's the biggest media baron. He has more television stations than the Chocolate King. But Viktor Pinchuk, he got his start by marrying the daughter of the former president, Leonid Kravchuk, in 2002. And Pinchuk is a great friend of Bill and Hillary Clinton. He has given, that we know of, $5 million. We know of one $5 million contribution by Pinchuk to the Clinton Global Initiative. And he was behind the scenes whispering in Yanukovych's ear, soft line, don't do anything, don't let those fascists run wild, don't arm the police, don't send in the tanks, don't do all the obvious things. Right? In other words, don't defend the law, don't go for law and order, let the fascists run wild. And indeed, he also, in this past week or 10 days, right before the coup, he put out a statement saying a peaceful solution must be found. It is imperative to refrain from the use of force and find a compromise. Bad advice. Bad advice. Back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. And welcome back to World Crisis Radio. And we're considering the tragic, pathetic weakness of President Yanukovych of Ukraine. Why did he let this happen? And this is something that is now going to claim a large number of victims in all likelihood. The Romans had an interesting proverb, principiis obsta, nip it in the bud, wehret den Anfängen in German if you like that, but nip it in the bud, principiis obsta. Fascism has to be nipped in the bud. Now, this was the problem faced by Gaddafi of Libya and by Assad of Syria. They did not crack down at the initial manifestations of a clear desire to provoke civil war and chaos and destroy the country. And in the case of Gaddafi, he paid for his life with this tragically, and Libya is now this hell on earth that we see, run by these lunatic fundamentalist militias. Assad of Syria had the advantage of a stronger state apparatus and also of the unfailing support of his own Alawite ethnic group, which helped him to recover. And there's every reason to believe now that Assad, unless and until the U.S. starts bombing, that he will prevail, that he's going to liberate Aleppo and similar areas, and that some of these terrorists are already leaving Syria. They're probably going to Europe and the United States for the next stage. In Egypt, of course, Mubarak tried for a while to respond, but then failed, and it has now fallen to General Sisi to assert the minimum requirements for the continuation of civilization, because that's what it is. This is civilization with its back to a wall, and the forces of chaos and destruction loom. So General Sisi, so we have to say Yanukovych turns out to be humanly inferior to Assad and to Sisi. Assad because he saw that this, don't shoot policy was no good. Let's also think, I mentioned it before, October 1922, Mussolini's fascist march on Rome. General Badoglio went to the king and told him, 5 minutes of gunfire and fascism will be over. It will be finished. The king, of course, didn't take him up on that, but that was true. Imagine this now. Suppose there had been the 5 minutes of gunfire. How bloodthirsty, how dare I say this? But look, a couple of hundred dead fascists, no fascist era, no Mussolini dictatorship, no Hitler, no Second World War, most likely no Franco in Spain, maybe no Salazar in Portugal, 1926, and on and on. In other words, all those things that could have been avoided by timely and decisive action. And statecraft sometimes requires this. It has to be done with justification, to be sure. Now, General Sherman, at the outbreak of the Civil War, General Sherman, at that time in California, reportedly said that the only way to quell the secessionism was to liquidate the entire class of men who dominate, control the politics of the seceding states. That of course, by then it was too late, and we had 750,000 dead, and consequences that we're still suffering under. So Yanukovych failed in these regards. Now, the capitulations. Yanukovych is guilty of repeated capitulations. In other words, the collapse of the army, the police, and the Berkut, the riot police, is because of repeated betrayals. One of the things that came very clearly out of this press conference of Yanukovych today was that he had kept the police unarmed, no guns, during this entire thing. And he went through this tear-jerking routine about how the police stood there with no guns and got shot at and had Molotov bottles thrown at them. They were burned alive and beaten, paving stones, slingshots, and so forth, and they didn't have any firearms to respond to. This reminds me of what we found in Syria, right? That at the beginning, Assad had given a no-shoot order to the army, and a lot of poor draftees got killed before that policy was changed. It reflects an exaggerated fear of the Anglo-American world media cartel. Let's just say we'll take up the chain of Yanukovych's betrayals. At the end of January of this year, right, when the current phase really started going after a kind of a quiescent period there, a little while in late December, early January, there was a great hue and cry from the mob that he had to fire the prime minister, Azarov, Azarov. This was a competent prime minister, pro-Russian, could have done a good job. So Yanukovych tried to appease the mob by firing Azarov. Fascist leaders looked at that and said, okay, time to escalate. On January 31st, the Ukrainian armed forces made a desperation call to Yanukovych to put an end to this emerging dual power situation, saying, servicemen and employees of Ukraine's armed forces have called on the commander-in-chief to take urgent steps within the limits of existing legislation with a view to stabilizing the country and reaching consent in society. The servicemen and employees of the armed forces say that the seizure of state offices is unacceptable to prevent representatives of state and local authorities from fulfilling their duties. This was the seizure of government buildings all over the country by fascist goon squads. Further escalation of the confrontation threatens the country's territorial integrity. So, what did he do? He was in the process of firing a fairly efficient prime minister. Yanukovych's website, he then went on sick leave. He said, I'm sick. I'm going to take a few days off. And then on his website, he promised the mob that he would, quote, show more understanding of the demands and ambitions of the people, taking into account the mistakes that authorities always make. What kind of double talk is this? This is an uncertain trumpet. And even by the time we got into the middle of February, Yanukovych says, there are lots of people urging me to crack down. He says, quote, I want to say that I am incited, and I am incited to use various methods and ways to settle the situation. But I want to say that I don't want to be at war. I don't want any decisions made using such a radical way. This was an engraved invitation to these hooligans, Yarosh and the Right Sector Gang, as well as Svoboda and Chanibok and other hooligans, that they should go on the offensive. All right, so that was a series of capitulations. In the last week, he capitulated twice. Remember that about almost 2 weeks ago now, it was on Monday, February 17th, he had basically made a deal with the fascist opposition there in the square, and he said, look, I'll give you amnesty for everything that you've done, provided that you leave the public buildings and the public squares, which you are now fortifying. And this was then put together with a change in the Constitution to reduce Yanukovych's powers. And that did not go through because at that point the party of the regions, which still had the majority, was not yet ripe for surrender. What this led to then was the following. Yanukovych says, okay, I'm releasing the prisoners, and I'm looking to you now, fascists, to leave the buildings and to leave the public squares, which generally they did not do. Instead, we got this repeat performance, as I pointed out, of the February 5th, 1934 march by the French fascists and monarchists on the French National Assembly. In Kiev, it was then a march by the fascists on the Rada, on the parliament. That was their response. You make a deal with them, they turn around and escalate. Back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio, our second hour. It's the 28th of February, and we are giving you an in-depth picture of the fascist coup in Ukraine and how this came about and what the implications then are. So it was on the Monday, February 17th, that Yanukovych made his next-to-last sellout appeasement deal with the fascists. They were supposed to get an amnesty, no prosecution if they went home. No more public buildings and squares fortified. There was this thing about weakening the presidency. That didn't go through. That was then seized upon by the pretext by the fascists to begin an advance, not to go home, but to go on a rampage. They started burning army trucks. They marched on the Rada. They didn't quite get there because the police were still there. The Party of Regions headquarters was taken over, ransacked. The city hall of Kiev was reoccupied. Again, army trucks burned and so forth. It was on Tuesday, February 18th, that the Interior Minister and the security chief put out a statement at 4 p.m. in the afternoon saying, clear the streets by 6 o'clock. We are going to start an anti-terror operation against the extremist groups. And they actually began clearing the Maidan Square at 8 p.m. The response by the fascists was to burn the headquarters of the trade unions. How about that? Maybe that's the dream of some of our libertarian and other reactionaries, right? Get rid of the unions by burning down their offices. Well, that was a specialty of Mussolini and then Hitler and Franco and every other fascist of the fascist era. It was perhaps in that evening of the 18th of February that it would have been possible to wrap this thing up. It could have been done back in November, December, or January, but since it got to be February, with tanks and APCs, armored personnel carriers, and helicopter gunships, it would have been possible to clear up this camp of armed rebellion going on, right? What no country in the world could accept, right? Certainly not anybody in Europe, not in the U.S., and we've documented that in the past. But the troops, essentially the Berkut and the police who were trying to clear the Maidan were not supported. It was inferior to what General Sisi did in Cairo last August, and therefore it failed. And you've probably seen these pictures, right? The armored personnel carrier of the Ukrainian forces getting essentially overwhelmed by Molotov cocktails and burning then like a torch, policemen on fire, many policemen killed. It was the biggest armed clash, violent clash in Ukraine since the breakup of the Soviet Union at the end of 1991, beginning of 1992. All of this on Tuesday. This was the night of the bonfires, right? This surreal, horrible situation. And it actually, it's often been called medieval, I guess, in some ways, with the people with these helmets and shields and everything. It does reflect the coming of neo-feudalism to this part of the world, right, where it was not stamped out until perhaps relatively more recently than people think. On the 19th of February, the right sector, one of the most extreme fascist groups in the Euromaidan, then went on to occupy the post office and the central control point of the television. Another critical capitulation by Yanukovych. On the 19th of February, that would be the Wednesday of last week, the previous week, a week ago Wednesday, he fired the chief of the general staff of the Ukrainian armed forces, Volodymyr Zamana. General Zamana was ousted, and he was replaced with the head of the Navy. And I don't understand what that should mean. The reasons for this were not given at the time, still trying to figure out what they were. But the idea with Zamana was that we get the idea that Yanukovych was trying to scapegoat him for the 80 to 100 dead of the previous days. And remember, a good dozen of those, if not more, were policemen. By Thursday of last week, February 20th, the rebels had retaken all of Maidan, and in the process, they had captured 67 police officers and a group of army soldiers, draftees, it is thought. But at this point, they then had prisoners of war in their custody, right, in their hold. Now, interestingly, on that same February 20th, the Thursday, a spokesman for the Russian military intelligence, the GRU, Colonel Alexander Musyenko, speaking on Pravda.ru TV, he came to the conclusion that the conflict in Kiev could only be resolved by means of force, and that Ukraine had shown it could no longer exist as an independent sovereign state. That is his commentary. I don't necessarily share that, but what he's reacting to is the fatal weakness of Yanukovych. Now, on February 20th, the U.S. and the European Union start threatening sanctions, general economic sanctions, individual sanctions, and at this point, enter Merkel. Angela Merkel, who this week was rewarded, I suppose, by being received by the Queen and getting to give a speech in Westminster Hall to the British Parliament. Merkel began reaching out to Yanukovych on the telephone. And again, this was now to second and to reinforce the appeasement message coming from the oligarchs. Merkel gets on the phone and says, look, we need a negotiated solution. Why don't you accept a mediation? And the mediation, this is the beginning of the end now for Yanukovych. He's already reeling because what the armed forces and the police and the Berkut had seen was that on the 18th and the 19th, and during that night of the bonfires, the night of the 18th to 19th, they saw that Yanukovych was too weak, too cowardly to provide sufficient support for the clearing of the Maidan. He was going to send them into harm's way, unarmed and unsupported, and on a suicide mission in some ways. And at that point, they began to melt away. The structures of the state began a partial collapse, and it's into that Merkel intervened. So Merkel says to Yanukovych, look, why don't you accept the French, German, and Polish foreign ministers coming, and they will help you get out of this situation. Now, the handwriting was already on the wall on the 21st. The Deputy Chief of Staff of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, Yuri Dumansky, General Dumansky, wrote a public letter resigning from the armed forces because he said he didn't want to be part of oppressing the people. Well, that's the kind of vacillation that you get when there's such an uncertain trumpet. Now, at this point, we've got the three there. Let's look at them for a second. Laurent Fabius, was Chirac called him Le Roquet, the attack dog, the nasty little dog, Fabius, French foreign minister. Frank-Walter Steinmeier. This is a social democrat from Germany, treacherous, and Radoslav Sikorsky, whose wife is this Anne Applebaum, Russophobe columnist of the Washington Post. They're mediating. Can you imagine? Back in a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. The tragic situation in Ukraine, full of the most ominous portent. No glory for Ukraine in this, only shame, opprobrium, horror, having reintroduced fascist power into Europe for the first time since maybe the middle 1970s with the fall of Franco and Salazar, with the last self-styled fascist rulers. So Merkel comes into the picture on the 20th and convinces Yanukovych to accept the mediation of the nasty little attack dog Fabius, the hack, although he's obviously a very treacherous hack, Steinmeier of Germany, and Radoslav Sikorsky. He should remember his famous ancestor who was assassinated by the British at Gibraltar during World War II, but of course he won't remember. He's now the prime minister, and he represents this crazy world of Polish politics with the Kaczynski twins and the rest of it. So, a deal. This, of course, the deal, even accepting this mediation, already accelerates the collapse of Yanukovych, as pointed out by Babic and others. Yanukovych fell because he didn't rely on his own supporters. Who were his own supporters? The army, the police, and the Berkut, if properly supported, properly equipped, properly deployed, could have taken care of this weeks and months ago. He didn't do it. And he also refused to lean sufficiently on his own people, the Eastern Ukrainians, the pro-Russian or Russian speakers, ethnic Russians, whatever we can call them, in the eastern areas of Ukraine. That would have been the solid base. Keep them together at all costs and then expand it from there. Instead, he chose to accept the promise of Merkel, the main austerity ghoul, austerity witch, and of course, Merkel, treachery for Merkel goes back to this. I think we've gone through it. That Merkel's father was a Lutheran minister in communist East Germany, DDR, and most of those Lutheran ministers were kept distance from the communist authorities. Merkel's father, Lutheran minister, evangelical minister, was one of the few Lutheran ministers who was an active supporter, a stooge of the communist power structure. This is how Merkel was able to go to university, get her science degree, become a chemist or whatever it is she is. So she's got treachery built into her DNA. So anyway, in come Fabius, Steinmeier, and Sikorsky. And what's the deal? Just the idea of negotiating, again, is already helping the whole thing to collapse. So the deal is return the Constitution to where it was between 2004-2010, weaken the presidency, have a presidential election in December 2014, investigate violence. This would be the Ukrainian government, the Ukrainian opposition, and the Council of Europe. No state of emergency, no martial law, amnesty for protesters, now for a second time, because the first one had gone up to the 17th of February. Now it's after the 17th of February. Surrender of public buildings occupied by protesters, give up illegal weapons, new election laws, new Central Election Commission, and that is then signed. And this is important. You have the three foreign ministers, Fabius, Steinmeier, and Sikorsky, essentially standing behind that deal, putting their honor on the line that they will see to it that that is enforced. The Russian mediator, who was also part of it, Vladimir Lukin, said, no, I'm not signing. We're not part of this. We're not going to go along with it. So that was then voted on in the parliament, and by this point, everything began to collapse, first in the parliament or parallel to the events in the streets. The acting interior minister, Zakharchenko, was fired by the parliament, ousted, and they also passed a bill to free the kleptocratic gas princess oligarch, Yulia Tymoshenko, the dyed blonde that you saw. And that was on the 21st of February. By the late afternoon of last Friday, a week ago right now, the riot police disappeared. They essentially, I think, decided, I don't know at what level, that they were no longer going to be fed into the meat grinder unarmed by Yanukovych. Above all, they stopped guarding the presidential compound, the presidential administration, and other key government buildings. Now, Sikorsky already claimed, he said, oh, my gosh, I'm astonished. This was not part of the agreement. Well, now the scene then shifts to last Friday at the Euromaidan, in other words, the fascist theater, right, the fascist proscenium, where these gesticulating figures strut and fret their hours on the stage. Yarosh, top fascist, leader of the right sector, says, I don't accept this deal. And a number of them, a guy called Parasiuk, comes out and says, Yanukovych must go by 10 o'clock tomorrow morning, because now they're emboldened because there are no military, police, or anybody else protecting the presidential palace. So we get Yarosh popping off, we get Parasiuk popping off, and this guy Liashko goes around with a pitchfork. That's his symbol. So he's the one who gets out there and says, by 10 a.m. tomorrow, Saturday, either Yanukovych resigns or we're going to take him away. And in the same session, the same meeting, you get Yulia Tymoshenko coming out. Now, the Oscars are coming up soon, right? The Academy Awards are Sunday night. And I understand that there's a move in the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences to alter the normal process of nomination to give Yulia Tymoshenko, by acclamation, the Best Supporting Actress award in melodrama for her tear-jerking sob sister performance in the Euromaidan fascist assembly on Friday evening about the heroes and how much she loves the heroes. Now, interestingly enough, Tymoshenko and her party, the infamous Baktipshina, they are taking the main offices, right? And she's an oligarch. She's as rich, more or less, as any of those other oligarchs that I was mentioning. She's newly minted in the past 10 years. Back in a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio, giving you an in-depth overview of what has happened in Ukraine, why you must oppose this fascist clique in Kiev, why the United States must butt out. Not one penny, not one soldier, nothing. Nix for this fascist gang of adventurers in Kiev, and do not get into an antagonized relationship with Russia. It's time for Mad Dog Kerry of Skull and Bones, and indeed his Portuguese fascist wife, to go home, disappear, get out. We've had enough. And indeed, warmongers of the Democratic Party, butt out, or you'll go the way of LBJ, and worse. It'll be much worse this time around. So this is an important moment. This is going to rankle for quite a while. We have Laurent Fabius, Foreign Minister of France, the Quai d'Orsay, Frank-Walter Steinmeier of the Auswärtiges Amt in Berlin, and Sikorsky of Poland. They pledged their honor to guarantee a mediation deal, and we just went through the provisions, and then within 12 hours or less, within 3 hours, you've got fascist leaders at the podium in Euromaidan, that famous cynosure of fascist attention worldwide. They begin saying, Yanukovych out by 10 o'clock the next morning, because demoralized, betrayed, and essentially fearful, the Berkut riot police, the army have all disappeared. They've left Yanukovych. He betrayed them. He wouldn't support them. They wouldn't support him. It's clear. So they begin taking over the presidential palace, and sometime between the Friday and the Saturday, probably in the night between Friday the 21st and Saturday the 22nd, Yanukovych flees. He's out of the picture. And from that point on, you've got to assume that everything the parliament does is because there's a gun-toting fascist hooligan with a knife and a slingshot and guns and everything else behind every deputy, every member of the Ukrainian Rada. So the deal collapses. Now, this will not be forgotten by Russia. This is betrayal. This is intolerable, right? Because these are diplomats. Their word is supposed to be worth something. From now on, Fabius, Steinmeier, Sikorsky, they're exposed as liars, and this will be resented more than what the West, NATO, and the U.S. did to Libya. Remember, the March resolution in the Security Council was to defend civilians, and it became regime change and even kill Gaddafi and break up the country and kick out the Chinese, kick out the Russians, and on and on. That has not been forgotten. So from now on, to talk of trust, reset, normal relations, it doesn't mean anything. And it's the fault of those European merchants of treachery that have allowed this to happen. So, a Friday evening, Yarosh, Parasiuk, and Lashko with his pitchfork, his trident, I guess, comes forward and says, 10 o'clock, he's got to be out. And indeed, he was out before 10 o'clock. Yanukovych had fled. And Timoshenko makes her tear-jerking sob sister performance. And not a peep from any of those foreign ministries or any other NATO foreign ministry. Now, just to show what the new regime is, what do they do immediately? On the 23rd of February, the Sunday, Rada says, up to now, Russian, Romanian, and Hungarian can be official languages in certain parts of Ukraine. Right? We're willing to, realize that there are people who don't understand, don't speak Ukrainian. Ukrainian, of course, from our point of view, more or less a dialect of Russian, but Russian, Romanian, and Hungarian as possible official languages. No more. Only Ukrainian. If you're put on trial, it's going to be in Ukrainian. Your taxes are in Ukrainian, and all the rest. The other thing that they do immediately is to begin groveling for the International Monetary Fund. This cabinet, we're going to get to them now in a minute, the cabinet comes forward, and they've got to be subjected, it's like the Roman arena, right, to the thumbs up or thumbs down of the Euromaidan. And it's very interesting. When, for example, Yatsenyuk, the prime minister, right, remember, Yatsenyuk of this Fatherland Party, a stooge of Timoshenko, right? Baktibshina Party, Fatherland, Timoshenko man. Yatsenyuk was Nuland's favorite, right? She's the one, she wanted him as prime minister because of his extensive economic knowledge. Well, what does that turn out to be? He's going to go to the IMF. And yesterday, Madame Lagarde of the International Monetary Fund confirmed that Ukraine has officially asked for help. They say they need 35 billion euros of help, 37 billion euros of help. Yats says that the government will now have to take unpopular positions. Unpopular. He says, in effect, this entire group of ministers that are coming forward now, despite the fact that they've been approved by the fascist gaggle there in Maidan, they're going to have to go on a kamikaze mission because their austerity and rigor and desire to save money, that's going to be so unpopular that they're going to end up as kamikazes. I don't know if he knows what he's saying, but he may be right. That may be exactly how he ends up. The IMF. Now, what's the IMF going to demand? Well, what did they demand before? The Russian government, thanks to a deal signed between Timoshenko and Putin, sells gas to Ukraine at something below the world market price. And the Ukrainian government, as a subsidy, as a help to impoverished Ukrainians, sells that gas at an even lower price. So there's a subsidy on the gas. It's like the Egyptian bread subsidy and similar things in Syria and in Libya. Indeed, the IMF doesn't like that subsidy. So one of the demands that blew up the deal back in November was the European Union and the IMF said to Ukraine, you want a rapprochement with the European Union, you've got to abolish your gas subsidy and radically increase the price of natural gas in the cold, unforgiving, merciless Ukrainian winter. Great. And the IMF demands that killer austerity be exercised against old people, pensions and health care, against children, education, health services, and others. And we'll see now exactly what they demand this time. But last time it was those killer austerity, genocidal austerity points that blew up the deal, which, of course, Yanukovych was perfectly within his rights to do. And as a matter of fact, he always stressed, I didn't end it. I just I postponed it. I kept it open. You know, now it's Yatsenyuk is going to be much weaker. Let's see what he comes up with. You've also got the new economics minister, Sheremetyev, an ideologue, right, neoliberal or Austrian ideologue. He's been part of telling the Malaysian government what to do, and I can't imagine he had anything good to contribute there. So when you look at it, generally speaking, these are IMF puppets, and of course they're associated with the main IMF puppet, who's Timoshenko. So that would be Prime Minister Yatsenyuk and President Turchinov, both of them saying, we're going to be very unpopular. We're going to impose killer austerity. Back in a minute. So Kiev is groaning under the Volksangel. This is now an IMF austerity regime enforced by fascists and neo-Nazis. How about that? Something new under the sun, I guess. Remember, the rapprochement of the Nazis with the CIA goes back to Allen Dulles and even earlier, right? The OSS, Donovan, but above all, the secret surrender of SS General Karl Wolff in Italy, masterminded by Allen Dulles. That book, The Secret Surrender, 1966. Take a look. If you look at Russia, it's long been the case, and I've stressed it, that you can be a Nazi, and as long as you're anti-Putin, you're a democratic force. And that would include this Limonov, right, the National Bolshevik. That's a brand of Nazism, I guess you could say, the great friend of Garry Kasparov. Navalny has a very strong, anti-Caucasus, anti-Chechen. He's a racist. He's a right-winger. He's, calling for violence, appears with guns in his video. And indeed, the Pussy Riot, these charming ladies are racist, anti-Chechen, anti-immigrant, extreme right-wingers. That's who you have. And we also have to thank, if we now have this confrontation set up between the United States and Russia, this was made possible by Assange, oh, wonderful Assange, allowing the Arab Spring to get going, right, destabilizing Tunisia and Syria and Egypt above all, with these revelations, right? And then with Snowden becoming an apple of discord, right? You roll in the apple and they fight over it. And Snowden has allowed that to happen. Latest news on Snowden is that he represents the CIA attempting to prevent the NSA from scooping up all the information about CIA covert operations. So in addition to the other dimensions of Snowden, to try to keep the left libs in a status of drooling passivity, Snowden represents the CIA asserting itself against the NSA. So you're getting caught up. Left liberals, congratulations. You're part of the CIA faction against the NSA. Great. Way to go. Way to spend your life as a dupe by being a left liberal. And Genome and Michael Moore and the Naomi, at least the Naomi Klein part of this. All right, now let's look at who's who. The New York Times this morning is trying to tell us that, oh, this cabinet, they're such good people. And we heard this on NPR, right? National Pentagon Radio, the Diane Rehm show. We're told that there's this guy, Musiy, M-U-S-I-Y. Oh, he was a medic. He was the field hospital for the protesters and all this. So we got some, cool people, some really cool people. There's an actor called Nishuk who sings these songs and everything. Isn't that wonderful? Sings the national anthem. Let's just look at it. The big winner, as I suggested before, is Timoshenko, the gas princess, kleptocrat, IMF, NATO agent, the dyed blonde, as we've now seen, on the road to getting the Academy Award on Sunday for her sob sister appearance. She doesn't want to be prime minister. She wants to be president or something better than that. Right? Maybe they'll reinstate the Grand Duchess of Kiev or whatever it is. But Timoshenko has taken all the marbles with the help of Victoria Nuland. Turchinov, the acting president until May, is a fatherland party, a stooge of Timoshenko. And Yatsenyuk, the prime minister, also fatherland party stooge of Yatsenyuk, of Timoshenko. Big loser, Klitschko and the Udar party, right? The punch party of the punch-drunk, brain-damaged Palooka Klitschko, lives in Germany, lives in the United States, right? Complete foreigner, heavyweight champion, but incapable of putting some words together. So his people are frozen out. It's obviously, as I tweeted very early on, the thing is going to be a collision between the Klitschko Udar forces and the Timoshenko. I should mention, for Yatsenyuk, when he was introduced to the Maidan fascists, the call went up, give him a bullet in the head. And I guess that refers back to a speech he once gave, saying, if I have to take a bullet in the head, I'll take it. Well, in this case, they're offering it to him. Then we have the Svoboda party. This is racist and xenophobic. They hate Jews. They hate Poles. They hate Germans. They hate Russians. The Muscovites or Moskali. Chanibok Alyech, he came out sort of in the middle. Some of his people are in the government. Let's see if we can figure out who from his party is in the government. Let's see. I think we've got this guy, Sich, S-Y-C-H. Alexander Sich. It's Alexander with an O. Alexander Sich, S-Y-C-H. This is interesting. He's a cabinet minister. He wants to ban all abortion, okay? And he says if women get raped, it's because it's their own fault. And he says if you clean up your lifestyle, If you clean up your lifestyle, you won't get raped. So the war on women, and remember, this is not a coincidence, that fascism is characterized by misogyny. Fascists hate women. We've seen this, right? This is a well-known characteristic. Then we've got, so Svoboda is in there, but then there's also the right sector. I think Avakov, the interior minister, is from Svoboda. He is the criminal who was arrested in Italy, the jailbird from Rome. And then we get to the right sector. Now, this is this guy, Yarosh. This is one of several candidates to play the role of Ernst Röhm, the brown shirt leader, and this Muzicho, Sasha Bili, the terrorist who went to work in Chechnya on the side of the Saudi-backed guerrilla fighters, right, along with Basayev and Doku Umarov and the rest of them, right? Basayev being the CIA. Who else do we have here? Kvit. Sergei Kvit is the education minister. This is an intellectual fascist. He's from the right sector. He's now the education minister. Oh, my God. Then there's an anti-corruption minister, Tatiana Chernovil, who has various nefarious stories. Her claim to fame is that she was beaten up, so therefore she's projected into power. Some of this stuff is rube bait. You see, they get the IMF agent at the top, and then they put some window dressing around it in the form of people, you know, who sort of shared in the privations of the Maidan, and others. We got the gas minister is Prodan, which apparently means that he's sold out. Sold. Comrade Sold is now the gas minister. Bulatov is also getting a ministerial fauteuil, and this is the guy who claimed that he was beaten up and had his ear cut off. So we got a couple of the martyr types in there, I think probably as rube bait. So that's what we're left with. Yanukovych was never legally impeached. Now, let's just think of a couple of other important items. There is a problem with natural gas, but remember, the ability of Ukraine to shut off the natural gas to Western Europe is now diminished because of the Nord Stream pipeline, which goes directly from Russian territory all the way over to Germany. They will not be able to cut off the natural gas in the way that they could have done it before. The other thing I would point to is the Holodomor, the so-called famine. One of the big belief structure points for these people around Lvov, Lemberg, Western Ukraine, is the idea that Stalin deliberately starved the Ukraine and killed millions and millions of people. I refer you to the authoritative study of Annie Delacroix, Annie Lacroix, R.I.Z., and her research, which shows that this was not a deliberate thing at all, that it was simply a crop failure that worked itself out. So it's based on a fraud. This is the equivalent of the stab in the back legend for Hitler. This is what they tell themselves in the Svoboda and the right sector. And we will be back next week. Remember, Adam for PA. You got to get involved in the Pennsylvania race for Congress.